Thank you for joining us for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act Broadband Updates webinar. There we go, that was transitioning. My name is Ryan Collins. I'm the broadband coordinator here at Buckeye Hills, and this is my contact information. In case you think of any questions afterwards, you can email me or call me. Doesn't matter which, I'm always happy to talk about this. So let's get into it. President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA, into law on November 15th of 2021. It was an act of Congress that represents the largest federal investment in infrastructure in over a decade. The bipartisan infrastructure legislation, as Drew said, provides $973 billion over 5 years from fiscal year 2022 through fiscal year 2026, including $550 billion in new investments for all modes of transportation, water, power and energy, environmental remediation, public lands, broadband, and resilience. $65 billion of this was allocated for the broadband connectivity and digital equity across the United States. So one of the biggest deals that it did was it updated the standards for broadband across the entire US. This is something that Buckeye Hills have been advocating for quite a while, along with our coalition Connecting Appalachia. So currently, before, areas were considered underserved if they were below 25.3. Now those areas are considered completely unserved, and the new standard for underserved is if it's below 100 megabits download speed, 20 megabits upload speed. This means that a vast majority of our region is now considered completely underserved. This will reopen the region to further funding outside the state broadband program currently going on if those areas are still below that 120 limit. They also added latency standards. That latency standard is defined as latency sufficient to support real-time interactive applications. And what that means in layman's terms is that the connection must be able to support things like a Zoom call or running a VPN. And it's a big deal that there's not only a standard for speed, but also for service. And currently, because these programs are still in their comment period and the final ruling has not occurred yet, there are many that are advocating for infrastructure standards as well, so that subpar materials can't be used going forward and that we can really future-proof the networks. But one other standard is that community anchor institutions are now considered underserved if they're lacking gigabit service. So the biggest program that was implemented by the IIJA for broadband is what's known as the BEAD program. The bill is going to allocate $42.45 billion to the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program, also known as BEAD, which would make grants to the states. If a state failed to apply for the funding, a local government could apply on their behalf, but the state of Ohio is already in talks to apply for that funding already, especially because we have a state broadband office. There is a minimum $100 million for each state for broadband expansion. If the state of Ohio receives a proportionate amount, it's possible that we could receive up to $2.275 billion. There is a rule within the bill that these funds cannot be excluded from cooperatives, nonprofit organizations, from public-private partnerships, private companies, public or private utilities, public utility districts, or local governments from eligibility for those funds. So what are the project priorities underneath the IIJA? It prioritizes projects that meet new minimum standards, but also future-proofs the networks. And the exact language in the bill is the term priority broadband project means a project designed to provide broadband service that meets speed, latency, reliability, consistency and quality of service, and related criteria as the Assistant Secretary shall determine. Like I said, we're waiting for the final comments on that, and there was a comment period for the BEAD program that just ended 2 weeks ago. And ensure that the network built by the project can easily scale speeds over time to meet the evolving connectivity needs of households and businesses and support the deployment of 5G, successor wireless technologies, and other advanced services. They will also be prioritizing expansion into rural areas and eligible entities that consistently rank below most other entities. They shall also give priority to projects based on the deployment of a broadband network to persistent poverty counties or high poverty areas. They will prioritize the speeds of the proposed broadband service, the expediency with which a project can be completed, and a demonstrated record of plans to be in compliance with federal labor and employment laws. And what this means basically is that they're no longer giving priority to just the least expensive project. They're going to try their best to give it to the best project going forward. The funds and the timeline for the BEAD program, a matching fund requirement of no less than 25% is expected, except for in high cost areas, which means much of our region would not need to provide a matching fund for these if they were to apply. Matches can be provided by the following. They can be provided by the state, a unit of local government, a utility company, a cooperative, a nonprofit organization, a for-profit company, a regional planning or governmental organization, a federal, regional commission or authority, or any combination of those. Matching funds can also be provided from the following sources. They can come from the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. They can come from CARES Act money, from the Consolidated Appropriations Act. They can come from ARPA funds. And then there is a 4-year implementation deadline, with exceptions if a plan is in place, construction is underway, or extenuating circumstances require an extension of time to allow the project to be completed. Now, I will add that these funds are not expected to be made available until next year. The FCC is still currently working on the maps that will determine the amount of funding that goes out to each state. It was announced this week that that data will be due around the beginning of September, depending on how the contract disputes go out for who is designing that map for the data. But expect an announcement on the funds being released by the federal government to the states in 2023, beginning or the middle of next year. So other programs underneath the IIJA broadband programs, we have the new Middle Mile program, which will provide $1 billion over the next 5 years. Eligible entities can apply to NTIA for grants to construct, improve, or acquire middle mile infrastructure. They must be able to connect anchor institutions at gigabit speeds, and there's a 5-year build-out timeline for all middle mile projects awarded through the program, with a possible extension of 1 year if certain criteria are met. And those that can apply for the program are states, political subdivisions of a state, tribal governments, technology companies, electric utilities, utility cooperatives, public utility districts, telecommunications companies, telecommunications cooperatives, nonprofit foundations, nonprofit corporations, nonprofit institutions, and any combination of those listed. And then there's the Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program. Any political subdivision, not-for-profit entity, community anchored institution, local education entity, or any entity that performs workforce development programs, or any partnership of these organizations would be an eligible recipient of a sub-grant to assist with implementing the state digital equity plan, or to pursue digital inclusion activities consistent with the state digital equity plan. Now, with our state broadband office, they will more than likely be the administering entity for the digital equity grants. It is listed in the IIJA that any political subdivision, agency, or instrumentality of the state, not-for-profit entity, community anchor institution, et cetera, would be eligible to serve as that administering entity. But as the state of Ohio has a state broadband office, that money will more than likely go to them. Then they will receive funding to develop and implement a state digital equity plan, and then make subgrants to the eligible entities listed above. And they will also serve as an advocate for digital equity and inclusion and a repository of best practices. On top of that, there's also going to be federal grants for broadband equity. Any political subdivision, not-for-profit entity, community anchor institution, local education agency, any entity that performs workforce development programs, or any partnerships of these organizations will be an eligible recipient of the grant to help implement any digital equity program going forward. All right. And then to help partners better understand the programs within the guidebook, the White House is launching Infrastructure School, a series of 12 webinars over the coming weeks that will provide an in-depth look into the programs contained within each of the 12 major chapters in the White House's recently released guidebook. Their broadband webinar is scheduled for Thursday, March 24th at 4 p.m. We will send the registration link in the follow-up email from today's webinar. Again, here's my contact information. If any of you have any questions after this that you think of, also listed there is a link to our website's broadband page, as well as to connectingappalachia.org, where you can go and take a speed test currently to add your data to the speed test maps for our region if you have not. You can also see our advocacy materials there, as well as our county broadband profiles to see what service really looks like throughout the Buckeye Hills region. And with that, I will open it up to questions. Just check the chat because I see someone in there.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. It looks like we do have one question on how high cost areas are determined. Have you seen any guidance or reference on that information yet?
So I'm seeing who asked that question. Paul, I have not currently seen any guidance on how high cost areas are going to be determined. I am sure that is currently being discussed at the NTIA. And at the conference I was at last week, they did say that that is currently in discussion. It's just going to be, my interpretation is that areas where in the past, typically ISPs would not expand due to either low population density or the high cost just to deploy infrastructure in general. So in areas of Appalachia where it's hard to deploy underground fiber because they can't dig, and so they have to build aerial throughout the area, and that increases the costs and things like that. Once there is more guidance, we can send it along, but currently there's not a lot of guidance on that particular stipulation. And I hope that answers your question.
And we will continue to send updates out through our member updates and our newsletter. I think one of the messages we keep seeing and hearing and that we've been sharing, is that this is a massive piece of legislation, and that all the federal agencies are still working through the implementation and the rulemaking, and it's going to be some time, as Ryan indicated earlier. Even the FCC is probably going to take the better part of a year for mapping to be developed in accordance with the IIJA.
Yeah, that is a big thing going forward, is that infrastructure takes time. I know with a lot of constituents, not just here in the region, but across the United States, with a lot of the stimulus packages that occurred due to the pandemic, it's forgotten that a lot of federal programs take a lot of time. And so the infrastructure bill is going to take years before we really see its impact, and especially for broadband, because as I said, those funds are not going to be released until next year for the expansion. And on top of that, then it'll go to the states and it'll go through a similar program, more likely than not, than what we had with the Ohio expansion grant. So then it'll take months for those applications, and then the awards will come down, and then we'll finally see building start. So it'll just take a long time, but hopefully, especially as there are more people paying attention to broadband across the entire country and here in our region, advocating for that money to be used properly. So 10 years from now, we won't have to do this again.
Right. And Ryan, can you mention too, we're going to send to several folks or several pieces of information to folks in the follow-up email today. One of those being information about ACP. Can you speak just a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So the ACP, previously known as the Emergency Broadband Benefit, a lot of you have probably heard of it as the EBB. The ACP is the Affordable Connectivity Program. It is the evolution of the EBB. The EBB was implemented as an emergency program within a stimulus bill. The ACP is the quote unquote permanent version of that. They allocated a ton more funding for it within the IIJA. It does reduce the benefit from $50 to $30, but we are encouraging people to share the information across their areas as much as they can. There's a particularly low sign-up rate for it. Most areas are below 25% of the eligible households signing up for the ACP. And we'll send information along to all of you after this for it, and you can spread it out to whoever you think would be a great resource to get that out into the communities, because it's a fantastic benefit. And there's a lot of ISPs that are now designing programs that would allow people to completely subsidize their internet through the ACP. And the IIJA requires a lot of the ISPs or entities that are going to be expanding programs to have an affordable program. And a lot of the comments that were provided to the NTIA were making sure that those affordable programs could be completely subsidized by either the ACP or by any other program to make sure that everybody can stay connected.
Thanks, Ryan. And yeah, so we'll be sending along to everybody who registered today more information about the ACP. We'll also send that link to the upcoming White House webinar on broadband. I believe Ryan's also prepared a chart of funding, and we'll of course include the recording to today's session and our slides. Nobody else has any further questions. I want to thank you all again for joining us. Please watch your email in the next day or so for the follow-up with today's presentation resources, and have a great day.